Okay. Good evening. Welcome. My name is Pat Kowitzel. I'm in a house full of kids and other adults, everything. So if you hear those folks coming in, I apologize about that. But we've got a wonderful event tonight, and really, it's appropriate that there's children's voices in the background here right now. We are just thrilled to be joined tonight by Dr. Kyl Myers, the author of the new book, Raising Them, and we're going to learn a lot more about that. But before we do, I just want to make sure that we talk a little bit about some of the other great events that we have coming up this week. We've got really three powerhouse events this week. Tomorrow night, we're going to be talking to Sarah Smarsh. Sarah has written a new book about Dolly Parton and the women who gained inspiration from the songs and music of Dolly Parton. And Sarah's last book was called Heartland, and that was a book that was a finalist for the National Book Award, and she came and joined us for an in-person event for the paperback, really right before the pandemic kind of took hold, and so we did that. That was one of the last events, not the very last, but one of the last events that we did in person. And so we've got this new Dolly Parton book. We're going to be talking to her about that tomorrow night. And then on Friday, we're going to be joined by Erin Brockovich. And Erin has written a new book about the water crisis around the country. And it's called Superman Is Not Coming. And she's going to be in conversation about that work. And that book is something that really takes a hold of some issues that deal with what we're going through here locally in Tulsa. And so Tulsa figures in the book and is something that is an important read for all of us. Next week, we've got a big week. Matthew McConaughey on Monday night, ticketed event for his new memoir, Green Lights. Neil Gaiman is also going to be joining us Monday afternoon. We're partnering with a lot of other independent bookstores to bring Neil Gaiman for a virtual event Monday afternoon. John Grisham is going to be joining us for a noontime appointment on Tuesday. And then we just booked Timothy Snyder, who is a historian at Yale and has written a new book about the healthcare system, small like his previous book on tyranny. And so that event is going to be next Thursday night. So there's a lot going on. I don't expect you to have memorized all that or been able to write it all down, but check out magiccitybooks.com for all of that that's going on. If you're joining us for the very first time tonight, welcome. We do these virtual events just about 2 or 3 times every week, and we've got that schedule going through Thanksgiving. So we hope to see you again soon. If you have a question tonight for Kyl or for Jessica, who will be in conversation, please post that in the Q&A, and Jessica will get to as many of those as she can throughout the course of the event. We'll also have links to purchase the book popping up in the chat as we're going along. You can go to magiccitybooks.com and kind of follow the links about Raising Them to be able to purchase the book as well if you don't want to break away during the event. So we are joined tonight by Dr. Kyl Myers, a sociologist, educator, and globally recognized advocate of gender creative parenting. Kyl's TEDx talk, Want Gender Equality, Let's Get Creative, encourages people to rethink childhood gender socialization in an effort to break up the binary before it begins. Kyl's the creator of www.raisingzoomer.com and the Instagram account @raisingzoomer. Kyl lives in Salt Lake City, Utah with their family. And joining Kyl in conversation tonight is going to be a great friend of mine and of Magic City Books, Jessica England, the secretary of the Tulsa Literary Coalition Board of Directors. And Magic City Books is a nonprofit bookstore that is owned and operated by the Tulsa Literary Coalition, and Jessica's leadership has been invaluable since we opened our doors. So want to join me in offering a warm virtual welcome to Kyl Myers. Thank you very much, Kyl and Jessica. Thank you, Jessica.
Yay, thanks so much, Pat. That was great. Well, fantastic. So Kyl, first of all, just thanks again for joining us. It is so cool to have you here and so wonderful to be in conversation with you. And I'm really pumped about our conversation today. And, I thought as we're getting started, when you and I were talking about this, why don't we just start with the basics? And if you can just share a little bit about what is gender creative parenting and why is it important?
Yeah. Oh, thanks, Jessica. That's a great place to start. So gender creative parenting is a parenting philosophy and practice and movement that gives gender freedoms to kids. So what it looks like for our family, I have a little kid named Zoomer who's 4.5 now. I didn't assign a binary gender to Zoomer when they were born. So I didn't put a girl or boy label on Zoomer at birth. They were just a baby or a human. And I don't disclose information about Zoomer's genitals to people who don't need to know, because I don't want people to think that they can like click and rely on a gendered script to treat Zoomer. And we use the gender neutral pronouns they, them, their for Zoomer or Z, until they could tell us what pronouns they wanted us to use for them. And it's just like all kind of couched in this like raising Zoomer in a way that teaches them about gender as a spectrum as opposed to a binary, and gives them the freedom to tell us who they are instead of the other way around. And to like jump into the why it's important, I think there's two like umbrella reasons of why I do gender creative parenting and why I think it's an important movement. The first is that I believe that gender is up to an individual to self-determine and doesn't need to be assigned. And I know a lot of intersex people and transgender and non-binary people whose parents didn't get their gender assignment right when they were born. And I just didn't want to make any assumptions about Zoomer's gender identity or expression or sexuality. I just felt really confident that they would know who they were and could tell us when they were ready. So we just wanted to hold space for them. And then the second reason is I'm a sociologist and I study sexist and like gender-based outcomes for people and have been doing so for the last 12 years. And so the second reason of why I want to do gender creative parenting is, as humans, we operate using a lot of stereotypes and binary scripts, and often without really critically thinking about the consequences of those. And so I wanted to protect my kid from gender-based oppression for as long as I possibly could, while also teaching my child to have a really like expansive understanding and inclusive understanding of gender. So there you have it.
Really fantastic. And one of the things that I appreciated about your book too is that it's really accessible. You know, it really talks about your personal human experience going through this. And you also couple that, like your sociologist is totally showing throughout the book too, because you bring in data and you talk a lot about, okay, here's how we feel about it, but then this is what backs that up. And I just found that really, it was a great balance and it wasn't overwhelming, especially to somebody who maybe isn't super familiar with this domain and really understanding, okay, what do we need to take away from it? But it was such a powerful reminder too. I mean, some of the studies that I've heard of in my life, and you know, even as an experience as a woman, I feel, you know, there was the study with the girls who were about to take a math test, and some were told ahead of time, like, hey, girls are usually not that great at math, actually performed worse versus those who just weren't told anything and just went in with their natural confidence, whatever that may be. And that's wild, like that can be so so vulnerable to those suggestions, right? So to your point, that those stereotypes, they have a very real effect on outcomes. And so, yeah, so thank you for the work you're doing and for talking about it. Are there any misconceptions about what gender creative parenting is that, you know, folks should be aware of?
Yeah, now that like I've been doing this for a while, I do hear the same misconceptions over and over again, and they kind of, I could put them into probably 4 categories. Like there's the first misconception is that children who are raised without an assigned gender will be confused and struggle to form their own identity. And that's just not true, right? Like these kids, I know a lot, there's not like a ton who are older than Zoomer, but there's several who I know of, and they're very self-aware, you know, and they claim these labels and pronouns for themselves and get really creative about it. And I feel like I know that they understand sex and gender in a more nuanced way than a lot of adults who I know. And so it's not like we're hiding information or language about sex and gender from these kids. We're actually giving them more information and language to talk about, you know, gender and bodies and sexuality than most kids usually get. So I am seeing that gender creative kids find what fits and they're just supported in doing so, right? And however conforming or non-conforming they are. There's also a misconception that parenting this way is trying to like force kids to be transgender or non-binary or queer. And that's not true. And I mean, like as a queer person, right? Like I don't think my parents, like my parents totally assumed that I was straight, and every transgender person I know was raised by parents who, thought and may have been forcing them to be the gender they were assigned at birth. So I think the moral of that story is that kids will be whoever they, want to be and are meant to be. Parents just get to decide if that kid's going to have an affirming childhood or not. There's misconceptions or maybe concerns that kids will be bullied, but I feel like, gosh, like I think about all of the things that I got bullied for, like I had a gap in my teeth, or like I wore the wrong brand shoes, and it's just kind of like, I choose not to go too far into that one, because I don't want to like try to tell my child, like, you should be smaller and conform to what the bullies want you to be, right? Like I want kids to live a really vibrant life, and Zoomer has made incredible friendships. They're only 4.5. Kids haven't seemed to be kids weren't really that concerned with gender, honestly, before 3 years old. So I guess I'll circle back on that in the next book. I can see how it's going, but we haven't really had, bullying so far. And then I think lastly, there's a misconception that gender creative parenting is really difficult to do, right? That like my daily life must just be this like hostile situation where I'm just having to like explain myself and justify myself all the time, that I must be like butting up against just like critics all day long. And that's just so not true. Like we have a really rewarding and joyful life, and our life, I think, looks remarkably like other people's lives who has, like a 4.5-year-old. So I think those are kind of like the main misconceptions that come up. Yeah, or just, just not really even knowing what it is that we're doing, So
Yeah, totally. I think that's really interesting. You talk about like bullying and the experience of these kiddos, and a lot of folks go through that, and some to a far greater degree than others. But there's, obviously a huge part of what you're doing, it's advocacy. You define it as such. And I think that's really interesting on a couple of levels. One, today, it's just a big part of the global conversation, right, in many different forms and formats. And you're definitely advocating for these kids to be who they want to be, and like on this great scale. And I'm curious, what was it like? Because you talked about how when you first started on this journey, there weren't resources, and there were like 2 families that you knew of that were even doing this, and now there's a lot, right? So it's obviously changed. So like, what was it like to start advocating in a space where there just wasn't a lot of conversation, and how have you seen it change?
yeah. So when I got pregnant in 2015, I knew about these 2 families because I had read about them in like 2011, 2012. So there was Sasha in the UK and Storm in Canada, whose parents didn't assign a gender, and they had like each done one interview, and that was it. Like that was my resources, of like, they exist. There's people who are doing this. And I knew I wanted to do it. And I had the experience. I'd been teaching gender and sexuality at the University of Utah. Like I'd been in graduate school, and I just felt like, well, I have to make these resources, right? Like I have to make this blog to like help explain what we're doing to our parents and our coworkers and our friends. And so I just was making the resources that I needed in my own life, and then just making sure they were public, and available for anyone who might need them. But I also like needed to find community, and there wasn't like a shared language, or like terminology. And so I made an Instagram account, and I just remember like those like middle of the night hours when I was like nursing Zoomer and just like searching hashtags, like maybe people are calling it this, right? Like maybe people just like searching hashtags, trying to find community. And like slowly but surely I would find people, and someone would go, oh, like I know my friends are doing something like that, and like would put us in touch with each other. And I think Zoomer was like a year and a half years old. and I got introduced to like a Facebook group, and there was like at the time like 90 people in it or something, and it just like, right, this like virtual community opened up to me and was just incredible. And it just was so validating, you know, to like find your people. And then I've just been able to like kind of build this community. But advocating for this can be really difficult. Like it's hard to open yourself up um, to so much criticism and harassment, which is why so many people who parent this way aren't public advocates, because it's not always safe to do, you know. And we have to make these decisions about like safety and privacy and how much to share, right? Like you believe in a movement and you know that like being visible about it is helping normalize it. But it's also tough. But I just felt this personal responsibility to do it. And now though, like there's so many new advocates, right? Like who are like, I'll take some of this burden. And as it gets more mainstream, as it gets more normalized, more people are doing it. And then like the advocacy network, right, becomes bigger. So I just don't feel as much of that pressure anymore, which is good. Plus like the stories need to be diverse anyway, right? Like all of us have these really different experiences. And so it's good to see diversity in the experience of how to do, right? Like we do it all a little bit different, but we're all kind of headed towards the same goal. So I think that that's good for people to have different ideas, and different like role models.
Oh, totally. And that's really interesting because you were just talking about the importance of community, right? So you kind of have this support network, and in your book, you talk about the experience that happened after you gave the interview with The Cut and how you had basically, said, okay, for a couple years, like, I'm not going to do any interviews. Like, I'm just going to focus on building my community and doing what I need to do here and supporting my family. And then you agreed to do this interview. And like, can you just talk about that experience? Because there was another funny thing that you had said early in the book too. And I remember reading it, was like, I wonder how long this is going to last. And you're like, okay, if I do this kind of stuff, if I publish anything out here, I'm not going to read the comments. Mm-hmm. How did that turn out?
Yeah. Oh, so in 2018, it was like February 2018, and a journalist with New York Magazine, her name's Alex Morris, she wanted to write a feature about gender creative parents. And I was one of like 5 or 6 families who were featured in this article, but we were the ones that had the public Instagram and the public blog. And so I was so naive to how like online like media works these days, right? Like I'd never given an interview in the 2 years, and I'd had this public blog and TEDx talk. And so I think I just figured like, well, if somebody was going to write a story about me, they would have done it by now. And so I did the interview. I was like, yeah, I'll do this because it's not like the spotlight's not just on us, it's on the movement. And then it came out in New York Magazine and The Cut. And just within like a week, it just started taking on this like global life of its own. And it was wild. I mean, it was just wild. Brent would follow it. My partner, Brent, would follow it. I just tried to like kind of be an ostrich and like put my head in the sand, because I was getting like Google alerts, about like my name. And like, so Brent was like, you're in Russian news today, and they have a picture of you like in the hospital bed, like the day of your C-section. I'm like, awesome. Like it was awful. So that happened. And I'm like, I think my like train of thought derailed there. I'm trying to, tell me again.
Just the experience of like, what was that like? I mean, this ties to things that we were just talking about, advocacy. Like you're putting yourself there in a real way, and people who don't know you feel like they can comment on all life and these assumptions.
It was brutal. That was brutal. And but it like kind of catapulted the movement into like more of the like mainstream zeitgeist, in a way. And so I was unprepared for it, and it was difficult, but it also like helped me grow a thicker skin and helped me like learn what my boundaries needed to be with like media and people. And with the never read the comments thing, I only read the comments on my Instagram account. Like it was something that I felt like I had control over, right? Like I could delete or block anyone who was like being a bully to me. And I just like there's nothing in it for me to go and like read the comments in an online newspaper's thing. Like I'm not going to go read the comments about me on like someone's Facebook or like like it was just, I couldn't see any value in going in there, right? Like I've never gone into the YouTube comments, you know, of like of my TEDx talk, and people will tell me, they're like, "Oh, it's bad in there," you know, and I'm like, "I'm sure it is." Like, I don't, you know, it means I'm doing something right, you know. I just didn't want to go in there because I just knew that it would just be this trash that would like fester in my brain, and so I stuck to it. You know, I made that commitment to myself. Before I even, you know, like started on this and stuck to it. And I think it's good advice. I would suggest it to anybody of like, there's nothing in there for you, right? Like say what you want to say in the interview, create what you want to create, but like Cheryl in South Dakota's opinion does not matter, you know? So.
Oh yeah, no, I think that is incredibly wise advice. You know, I'm sure many of us on the call tonight have experienced that in some facet or another. There's certainly like no lack of conversation happening, you know, on the in the world right now. You know, something that is also really interesting too is, you know, this is so much anchored on identity, right? And how our identity, whether it's how we perceive ourselves or how the world perceives us, experiences, you know, or changes the experience, our experience in the world. I'm really curious if you can talk a little bit too about how, you know, gender creative parenting has an effect on some of these broader concepts of identity, whether, you know, or parallels in other conversations that are happening today around race or, you know, class or things like that.
Right. I think they're so related, and it's not like in my parenting I like only teach Zoomer about gender, right? Like I think so many of the frameworks, it's all about oppression and systems of power and like human diversity and moving towards a more like expansive, inclusive, celebratory way, right? Of like interacting with people. And so I think that the majority of people who are doing gender creative parenting are not only involved in anti-sexist work, but are also involved in like anti-racist, anti-classist, anti-ableist, anti-homophobic work, right? And because we understand that people's identities are intersectional, right? And like you're not just a gender or a sexuality in a vacuum, right? You are also, we have like racial and ethnic identities, right? And so much more, right? Like our age, our class, our education, where we live, our religion. And so I think as parents, I'm not shying away from talking to Zoomer about numerous aspects of identity and privilege and social justice. And I think especially because of like the privileges that we hold, right? Like I think it's really important to talk to Zoomer about what's going on with like Black Lives Matter and police brutality. It's really important to talk to Zoomer about disability and mental health, right? So I think it's all interconnected, right? Like because the thing we're trying to dismantle here and topple is like the patriarchy, right? Like which is white supremacy, which is classism and nationalism and ableism and homophobia and misogyny. So like it's all one really big nemesis, you know, that like we're going after here. And I don't think kids are too young, right? Like that's such a privilege, right? That like Black parents don't get to just like not be thinking about, right, like police brutality and not talking to their kids about it, and white parents have to do the same thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that's an interesting segue. There's a couple of questions, so I'm keeping an eye on the chat here too, so I'll come to those. So for those of you that are putting them out there, thank you. And one thing that we had talked about before too, that's really interesting is your experience on the whole, especially at the beginning when you were going in and preparing for your C-section and telling friends and family, was positive and very much, you know, the opposite of what I think a lot of people expect that to be. And you had mentioned, you know, in your book too, that probably not a small component of that positive reception was because you present as, you know, this white, upper middle class, you know, for all perception, you know, cisgender, like just not rocking the boat. And so there was less to maybe create friction. And so I'm curious, especially in the spirit of advocacy and, and bullying and all these experiences, like what might that experience be like for parents who don't have that kind of privilege?
Yeah. Well, I do hear from my friends, right? Like our experiences are all across the board, of like having positive experiences or negative experiences. And it isn't always landing like where you think it's going to be landing, like race wise or sexuality wise or like family formation wise. And I think everybody has a roller coaster of it, right? Like it's not like every single experience that I've had has been positive, and it's not like every single, experience of people who have different identities than me has been negative. But I am totally aware of how much my privilege, like the privilege, like my white privilege and able-bodied, educated, like I'm employed, I have stable housing and income and health insurance. Like and I also have these passing privileges too. Like I'm queer, but I'm married to a man. And so I don't like, even though I come out a lot, I don't experience this like direct homophobia, right? Like in all of these interactions that I'm having, as much as I would if I was partnered with like a woman or a non-binary person. And so I think that like my privileges have totally made my life easier, my parenting, like just being a parent, easier. And then like, of course, like gender creative parenting, I can see that my demands like in spaces, I mean, first of all, right, that I'm so privileged that I'm like, excuse me, I have demands, like, but that they're taken so much more seriously around gender creative parenting because I have a PhD. And that's not fair, right? And like, it's not fair because it's not like you have to have a PhD for this like parenting, practice to resonate with you, or for you to be able to like have your requests respected, but I do, right? Like, I think it's because I have this confidence around it, which, so many of us do, but it isn't fair that like I get treated so much more, just like with so much more respect and accommodation around gender creative parenting than a lot of other people do, which is why I feel so obligated to be showing up in this fight, right? Because like I'll take the heat. Like I will get dragged through Twitter by trolls. So other people don't have to, who don't have like the same like safety and security as I do. And I think that this is just, I think it's becoming more aware to people because of like the anti-racism like framework that's starting to like drip into a lot of white people's minds of like, oh, so like it's not on people of color to fix racism, like it's on white people, and I feel like it's the same for like, it's on cisgender people, it's on straight people, it's on people who are in these privileged positions to dismantle these systems of oppression that benefit them, because there's liberation on the other side for everybody, including like including you, privileged person. So like, I know that people are having a harder time than I am, which is why I feel
Think that was just Kyl's screen that froze. So we'll give her a second to hop back in.
Oh, sorry, I'm back.
Okay, we're good. Awesome.
Sorry. Oh, there were some real gems in there. So no.
No.
I don't know where I left.
Well, why don't we use that as an opportunity to switch gears and go to some of these questions, because I think one is related, I mean, you're by and large a positive experience, and thank you for doing that work, because I think it has made a difference. I mean, clearly just in the couple of years that you've been working on this, the conversation's bigger, and you, by building a community, there's all kinds of energy and momentum that comes along with it. But not every scenario that you walk into becomes this happy, teachable moment, right? Like you do run into friction. And there's a question from Jill, and Jill says, how does Kyl address the people in Zoomer's life who refuse to adopt or respect her parenting technique and her choice to allow Zoomer to remain non-binary until they decide their gender? For example, family members versus other children versus adults at school or extracurricular activities. How does her approach differ between these groups? And I'm thinking, you certainly talk about them in the book, but I'll give you space to answer.
Sure. So Zoomers started identifying with a gender when they were 4. I use like they, them in public spaces because I want Zoomer to be able to have the autonomy to like share their gender when they're ready. So since they were 4, they've had a gender. So I think that like they're kind of advocating for themselves now, like if they ever get like misgendered, they're like, no, 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 these are my pronouns. And like it's cool to watch, right? But before that, like our world was so small. Like, and I had these anxieties before when I got pregnant of like, I'm going to have these conversations all of the time. But what was happening, I would just have to kind of proactively have the conversations once. For like, I found a school that I wanted to get on the wait list for when Zoomer was, we got into a daycare when they were 5 months old. And I talked to the director and I took the time to like tell her what gender creative parenting meant to us and tell her what like that would look like, right? Of like, don't just try not to stereotype my kid, which I think a lot of other parents were like, yeah, we'll have some of that too. Like I think that truly most of the parents who went to, whose families were at Zoomer's preschool, we all had really similar parenting values, and so we were being a little bit different in wanting to use they, them pronouns. And people, would get the hang of it. And sometimes they'd slip and we were like, don't be hard on yourself. We get it, but like everybody was working towards in that school setting, right? Everyone was working towards, and we had some people who would come up to me and say like, I want you to know when I first heard about this, like when I first knew that like Zoomer was going to be in my classroom, like I was not excited about this, right? Like I don't like, this isn't the culture, like just kind of had some like cultural differences or like language differences of like, I don't know how to use they, them, but they come to me afterwards and we're like, but like, I've been getting in the hang of it. And it is making me realize I treat these kids really, really differently. Like I'm treating the boys very differently than I'm treating the girls. And by having Zoomer just exist in this classroom, it's making me realize that, right, and know that like I don't want to be doing that. And so there was like, there would be these like full circle moments, right? People who like didn't want anything to do with us just wouldn't have anything to do with us, like at gymnastics, if they're like, I hate what is happening here, like they just would like go away, like they would just like wouldn't talk to us during the 40-minute gymnastics class. But it wasn't happening that often, also because we weren't like walking in and being like, hi, we're Kyl, this kid doesn't have a gender. We would just kind of like come in, do the balance beam, and like kind of get out, so I there was actually less friction than I think people assume there will be, but like, right, like we just do a lot of proactive education. And I think people are kind. I think just like they might be curious. And even if they don't agree, they're like they're not the type of people who are going to be like rude to our face. And I think it's just because we have so few places where we have to have these conversations, and now it's different because it's like, oh my gosh, like I don't have to like lead with this really anymore. Like Zoomer has a gender, and it feels really weird, of like my identity is shifting of like having done this parenting practice for so long. So I hope that that's helpful, Jill. Like I hope that answers the question of like, there was a lot of proactive education and people would share with us that they weren't into it, and that's okay. Like that was okay, and
Well, and Kyl, there were moments where you held your ground too. And I think, making sure that you were taking Zoomer to places that were inclusive and weren't creating these binaries, which is going to be a segue to our next question. But, like at the race, where Zoomer was like so pumped to go just race with all these other kids. And, you found out they were dividing amongst gender lines and you just said, hey, like, we're not going to do it. And I mean, those are choices to make, right? That's part of advocacy. So
yeah, and it sucks, like it sucks to have to make those choices sometimes, but I stand by that, like I stand by the hard decision that it was to leave, and like not let your kid participate in something that was gender segregated and you don't want to be complicit in, like, yeah, it hasn't been total cupcakes and ease. But I think that that's part of it, right? Is like, no, right? Like, and especially because gender stereotypes are so sneaky and so insidious that I think the well-intentioned people don't even realize like, like what's being implied by segregating things by gender. So
Totally, totally. So this next question comes from Erin. Erin says, thank you, Dr. Myers and Magic City. This is an incredibly informative and engaging discussion. My question is, gender seems to be a specific place in society today that binary thinking is being challenged. So this is a place where binary thinking is being challenged. So have you seen other binary thinking or other binaries in your world that are affected by your decision to practice gender creative parenting?
That's a really great question. I think I'm feeling like nothing is binary anymore. Like everything has more nuance than a binary, especially with identity. Like I feel like my like right and wrong, black and white, like those are really blurred, and I feel like everything's really gray. So yes, I mean, I feel like it's not. I like nothing feels like it can be categorized as either or in my life anymore, and that's just like kind of how it's been. And I actually think that that's actually been kind of like good, like even in like with like an election year, like I'm finding myself not being like, I'm on this team and you suck. Like that's not what's happening. Like I'm feeling like this is complicated, and I feel like my brain, right, has had to be trained doing like gender creative parenting every single day of like things aren't always right. I don't want to make assumptions. I want to critically think about this, and trying to kind of like override my bias. I think that that's happening. Like I wouldn't call myself like a moderate person, but I'm just trying to be fair, right? And like not make so many snap assumptions about people based on like maybe a word that they use to describe themselves, or like an identity that they like align with. And I'm grateful for that. Like I'm catching myself, right? Like just maybe being more like compassionate and kind to like human diversity across the board.
That sounds like a pretty awesome thing. Also a good segue to our next question here. Let's see, I'm going to try to use this Q&A thing, see if I can do it. So Matt says, first, I want to say thank you. Matt says, I'm a young transgender man who's grown up in Oklahoma his whole life, and the work that you're doing, the community that you're creating, and the hope that you're giving to folks like me is downright inspiring and invaluable. My mom is currently reading your book, and it's helping her to understand someone like myself who has come to understand who they are over the years. So my question for you, Matt's question for you, is how can advocates in the LGBTQ plus community like myself help support kids like Zoomer in the movement for rights, acceptance, and understanding?
I love that. Well, thanks, Matt. So I am finding that even in like LGBTQ community, there's still a lot of binary thinking. There's a lot of assumptions that happen. And I think that no matter what like industry you're in, you are either like interacting with kids or you're interacting with people who used to be a kid, right? Like, and I feel like there is just so much more room in like the LGBTQ community to have more like vulnerable experiences with people, more storytelling, right? Like more sticking up. Like I think by knowing about gender creative parenting, I'm seeing a lot more conversations around like gender reveal parties, and a lot more like advocacy there that's coming from LGBTQ community of like, like what if your child's trans? What if your child's non-binary? What if they're intersex? And I just think that there can be I would like there to be a call-in culture, right? Like among like LGBTQ people, like because we can just be really gentle advocates and like move things along. But I just think like if you feel something like icky, right? Like it's just so important to go, oh, this isn't sitting right with me. And I have found that like the way that I'm making the most progress with people is through just like really loving and gentle and accessible communication. Like even like my parents who were like, I don't understand, like what you're doing or like what you're about, but like I love you and I support you and I want, and I want to learn. And so I think if I would have like abandoned them, every time they slipped or messed up, right? Like we wouldn't have been able to get to this spot where now my parents have become really incredible advocates. So like I'm all about gentle advocacy, and like taking care of yourself, but like I hope that that's helpful of just like this is a marathon and not a sprint. And I want to have compassion for people who like aren't where we are on like our gender knowledge, our, because it's like we were all somewhere before, right? Like I kind of think back on like my teens, and my early 20s, and I'm learning new things every day, and I just, if someone would have like written me off because I didn't know as much as them, I would have never gotten to where I am. So I want there to be just more like compassion and not like canceling or getting just, but being like, we're not using the word hermaphrodite anymore, Dad, and I think that that's good, like I think that it's good to use humor and storytelling and be kind and know that like intentions are probably good, so I hope that that's I hope that that's helpful. But just, I don't know, when you see something, say something is my motto.
Well, that's great. You talked a moment ago about how your own like identity has shifted as Zoomer has gone through their journey. And it's interesting because, gender creative parenting, it seems like it's pretty kid focused, right? It's about the kid and creating the space there, but there's this mirroring that's happening, right? This very real shift that happens for the parents, right? And those that are supporting that kid. And I'm curious if you could talk about what that shift is like between, in a parenting relationship, like in that partnership, or for parents that are maybe doing this solo, or what that's like.
Yeah, that's a great question. I actually have been so surprised at how the first few years of gender creative parenting were actually so grown-up centric rather than like kid centric, right? Like, of course, like the kid was in the room, but I feel like so much of gender creative parenting was Brent and I having a lot of communication about equally sharing parenting. That was a really important component to us of like the way we can model that like all genders are equal here is if we're both showing up equitably in this partnership, and so like we're going to both support each other in our careers, we're going to both take care of Zoomer equally. And so I think that like equally shared parenting was a really big part for Brent and me. And that's not, I mean, like there are like multi-adult families and there are, like single parents and stuff. And so like everybody has really different backgrounds, right? And like things that they need to be doing. But that has been something that has just been like this constant communication, which I think it's for the better for me and Brent. And so it's just been interesting to see that like I don't feel as much of the like I don't really resonate as much with like a lot of the conversations that go on of like moms who are so pissed at dads who like aren't cooking, aren't cleaning, don't change diapers, aren't, like picking the kid up from school when they're sick. I don't resonate with that because like Brent and I from day one, right? I was like, you're not putting a baby in me unless A, we're doing gender creative parenting, and B, you equally parent this kid, And Brent was like, you got it. Like, so I think that like that has been really, really important. But then just the second thing is just seeing how much Brent and I, how far we have come, even with just like this commitment of narrating the world in this really gender expansive way for Zoomer. It's totally changed our brains. Like it's changed our brains, it's changed our vocabularies. And I hope has made us better in our workplaces, right? It's made us better. Like we don't misgender a flight attendant or a barista, like because we're just in this habit of trying to like practice what we preach, and I think that that's been great. And now we're seeing it show up in Zoomer the same way,
Oh yeah, no, I think that's amazing. And that I'm curious too if you could talk a little bit about, and you mentioned this earlier with Zoomer, over the years now Zoomer has chosen a gender and has pronouns and is kind of is on their journey,
Yeah.
and I'm curious if like what seeds do you see planted? And I'm going to also couple this with another audience question. So this is from David and Mare, and they're saying that now that Zoomer is preschool age, where gender typically becomes more of a focus for kids,
Mm-hmm.
I think Zoomer is feeling more pressure from classmates to conform to gender stereotypes, and if so, how have you handled that?
Yeah.
Zoomer is kind of handling it.
Yeah. Well, it is a great question, because it was like this like blissful few years, right? Where kids are like not that verbal, and they're just like talking about like farts more than gender. And it was just great. And I was just like, we did it. Like, it was like this blissful few years. And then they start getting verbal. And then all of these kids start like, they start policing gender, right? And I remember what has happened with Zoomer, what I think is evidence of gender creative parenting is Zoomer's awareness of the gender binary was delayed, like further than their peers. And it's because I think they were getting a really different type of like upbringing at home, right? And like their mom is like sitting there with them watching Netflix, shows. And it's like if a TV show was like boys and girls, I'd be like, and non-binary pals and intersex kids, like, like I am not like impossible to live with. I'm a fun mom. Okay. But so I think that like Zoomer was getting such a gender creative education at home, but then of course, right, watching TV, exposed to the media, has friends, have peers. And so what happened is, this isn't in the book because it's happened since the book came out, but I remember coming to pick Zoomer up from preschool one day, and their teachers saying, like pulling me aside and saying, I just want you to know that a lot of the kids are starting to like kind of police each other of like, you can't play with that, you're a girl, you can't wear that, you're a boy. And she was like, I want you to know that Zoomer's not doing that, but Zoomer's hearing it, and it's like, yeah, like, thanks for telling me. But it was like, it was good to hear like my kid isn't the gender, like police. So it was just that felt really good. And it's, like it's showing up now. They have questions, like they didn't get raised in a vacuum by any means. And so, but I think that they just aren't as like committed to like enforcing the binary. And that's been really, really amazing, and I think that what's so cool these days, like, and where we live in Salt Lake City, and we like, they go to kind of this like progressive school, and you couldn't walk into Zoomer's preschool and go, oh, there's the one that was raised gender creative, right? Like there's all sorts of kids like who are like all looking all fluid and gender bendy, and it's cool. And so I think that like it's a really awesome time to be doing this, right? Like it just feels like we're all kind of, doing this in a way. So that feels really good. And even though they have pronouns that they like and, words that they like to use for themselves, their expression and interests are quite fluid and like not locked into like a stereotypical category. And they ask a lot of great questions, about gender, and they have a really expansive vocabulary, and like they use gender neutral words, and they have an understanding of humans that isn't limited by the binary. Like they know what intersex means and non-binary means, and they understand polyamory, and they think all doctors are women because all of their healthcare providers, have been women. But so I actually just think though that we're like just getting started, and I think that like kindergarten's going to be like a whole new can of worms. And it's hard. Like it's so hard. Zoomer comes home and I'm like, no, like I feel like I'm like fighting with like these little, like it's like a tug of war, with their little preschool friends. Like Zoomer comes home and is like, yeah, well, like Patrick said this. And I'm like, Patrick's wrong. Patrick's 3. Like, so I don't know. But yeah, Zoomer's off to such a better start than I was though when I was 4, and that's what I have to remember is it's a marathon and not a sprint, and we're miles ahead of where I was when I was a kid.
Totally. Did you keep track of Sasha and Storm's journey? Like, have you?
A little bit. So I know that Sasha, well, last I read, like, I think when Sasha was like 5 or 6, there was like a news story that like Sasha is a boy, and I can't remember if Storm is a girl or like she, her pronouns and they, them. I don't know. Like, I can't remember, which I think is so cool, right? Like, that's part of it, is like, people are just like, ugh, like, you've put so much attention on Zoomer. I'm like, okay, by the time Zoomer gets a smartphone, there's going to be so many kids who are raised gender creative. Like, no one is going to remember this, like, no one is going to care. Like,
I mean,
well,
maybe those like Russian news sources that have like,
yeah.
um, that's really interesting. Well, I know we have just like a couple more minutes left, so I want to make sure, to give you space if there's anything that you want to add, and then if not, just kind of like a final question or a duo question, really like, what's giving you the most hope right now in relation to, gender creative parenting, and then what's still keeping you up at night?
Um, I think what's giving me hope is seeing how exponential the gender revolution has happened. I mean, truly, when Zoomer was born and I had little newborn Zoomer, and someone at a coffee shop would be like, is it a boy or girl? And I'd do my little, like, we didn't assign a gender. This is Zoomer and we use they, them pronouns, like, and they'd go, well, I mean, it was just like they, them pronouns for one. And now 4.5 years later, everybody knows someone who uses they, them pronouns, and so I just think just the rise in awareness of like the non-binary identity and they, them pronouns, and just the gender spectrum, and just like people being so fed up with, like oppression, like that gives me so much hope of like, oh, we might like I'm just so excited to see what am I going to see in my lifetime around gender, right? Like, how incredible to think that like the first 30 years looked one way, and I think the next 30 years are going to look incredibly different. And it's largely because of these like younger generations and social media and visibility and community. So that gives me so much hope. I think we're headed in the right direction. I think what keeps me up at night is that there's like so many people now that I kind of feel like a conduit of like a lot of people reaching out to like ask questions and share feelings, like, because this story is resonating and this movement is really growing. And I don't have enough like hours in the day. And I just hope that like there's still a lot of pain out, like there's still a lot of pain and a lot of trauma and a lot of homophobia and transphobia. And it's just like, we got to get moving quicker, right? Like, there's still a lot of work to do. So I just wish I could like speed it along somehow, and like also just like bring everybody, like into like a safe spot. But one thing I will just say is I a lot of people will hear about like gender creative parenting and they'll go, I wish I would have known about gender creative parenting earlier. Like, I would have done it with my kids. And to that, I say, start now, right? Like if your kid's 2 or 8 or 28, you can talk to them about gender and sexuality, and that like, hey, I'm learning new things about gender and it's different than when you were born. And I just want to open that door, with you and have that conversation. Like, I just think like even how powerful that was for me in my 20s when I came out as queer to my parents, that just like, and that like is still a conversation that needs to happen. I just think start now. Like, if anything that I have said has resonated with you, start now. Like, put your pronouns in your email bio, right? Like, speak up. If it's like you see a drop down box that's like men and women, be like, and intersex friends and non-binary pals, like, you have to speak up, because it has to be the majority who's going to be able to like move this for like, the smaller marginalized minority. So that is, like my thing of like, you can start now, and it's like, you can always just like wake up committed to do better than you did yesterday. So that's
Yeah,
my 2 cents.
it's a marathon, as you said.
Yeah. So be gentle to yourself, stay hydrated, rest, and invest in good shoes. Yeah.
That's important. That's important. Chapter. This is so great. Thank you so much. And just to, and thank you to everybody who joined tonight. This is super awesome, super fun conversation. So if folks want to find out more about what you're doing, so obviously they can get a copy of Raising Them, which is a really awesome overview, but where else can they go to find out more about what you're doing?
I'm pretty active on Instagram at Kyl_Myers. I guess I could put it in like a chat or a Q&A or something. So Instagram at Kyl Myers, and my website is kylmyers.com. Like, I'm around, I'm on social media. Don't find me on Twitter. I think it's a garbage can and it scares me so much, and I don't spend much time in there. Oh, this is so mean. Yes, that's my Instagram. So follow me there. And I'm actually putting together, I'm like taking my university gender and sexuality course and I'm turning it into a public access course. So that'll be out in the next couple of months. Yeah.
That's awesome. Thank you so much.
Oh,
I appreciate it. This was great.
thanks for having me, Jessica. It was so good to talk with you.
Yeah, likewise. Pat, I don't know if there's anything else that you need to do to wrap us up, but just thanks again for the opportunity to have a conversation. And thanks again to everybody who showed up tonight. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.